Hi there, Alex Kidman with my video review of the Realme X3 Super Zoom. Now, Realme is a fairly new brand in Australia when it comes to the mobile phone space, and so far what it's concentrated on has been largely budget phones or low mid-range, basically $500 and below phones. Decent value, some interesting concepts there, but definitely on the cheaper side of the scale. That's not what this phone is. The model I'm holding right here costs $799. There's a slightly cheaper variant at $699 with slightly less RAM, slightly less storage. But this is resoundingly in that mid-range space. And sure, we've had to slightly redefine what that means now that flagship phones can kick north of $2,000. But still, this is a mid-range device, and it's a tricky market to be selling in. And the reason for that, it's sort of Realme's fault. Not just Realme, but plenty of other companies as well who have been producing really good budget phones. What you can get for kind of $300 to $500 now is sufficient for a lot of people's needs, and it makes it hard to justify spending those couple of hundred extra dollars because you start to fall into that bracket of, well, if I'm going to spend that much more, maybe I should just go the whole hog and go for a full-on luxury flagship phone. So what makes the Realme X3 Super Zoom stand out? Let's take a look. I'll be honest, with the design, when I first took the X3 Super Zoom out of its packaging, I thought, this thing looks sort of familiar. I feel like I've seen this before. And the reason was because I sort of had. It's very, very similar in design notes to Oppo's Find X2 Pro, which I've got just here. And I've already got a video of that up on the channel if you want to take a look. And look, this isn't coincidental. Both brands are owned by Chinese mega firm BBK Electronics. They're also the people who own the OnePlus brand, if you care about that kind of thing. And both phones feature this vertically oriented camera design. And look, it's a bit of a standout. It's different to what everyone else is doing. It also creates this very, very large camera bump on the phone itself. And it means it can't sit flat on any desk. Now, the saving grace here is that Realme does provide a simple plastic case in the box. I strongly recommend you use it both to protect the phone and also because it reduces that camera bump quite nicely. You might notice as well that there's no fingerprint sensor on the back. And look, with prior Realme phones, that's been because they've used an in-display fingerprint sensor. You don't get that here. Instead, there's a side-mounted sensor just there with a standard mechanical fingerprint sensor on it. Now, I've got to admit, I don't love it a lot. The button itself is also the power button, and it feels just a little bit loose. Also, its pickup is not spectacular. I think I probably would have preferred either a full-on rear case button or an in-display one. But you can get used to it, and obviously you can use other unlocking methods as well, depending on how much security you want. Now, at the front, you've got a 6.57-inch LCD display. Now, in this price bracket, yes, you can get AMOLED displays, and they're typically a little bit nicer. The big selling point here, though, is that this is a screen with support for up to 120 Hz. Now, we've seen 120 Hz screens in other phones this year, but they've pretty much all been flagship models. This is pretty much the cheapest phone that I've hit with a 120 Hz capable display. And it can look really, really nice with the right material. It can look glorious. There is a bit of a battery cost to using that 120 Hz screen, and you do have the option. You can keep it stuck in 60 Hz, you can keep it stuck in 120, or you can put it into auto mode where it's meant to intelligently select the best refresh rate relative to what you're doing at that time. That's largely what I've done, and based on my own battery observations, I think it throws it into 120 Hz most of the time if you're in auto, or maybe that's just the way I use this particular phone. You don't get a whole lot of controls on this phone, just standard volume and power button. There's no assistant button to speak of. There's also no headphone jack, which is a bit of a pain. I prefer the flexibility of having that option, but you'll just have to use USB-C or Bluetooth headphones with this device. I'm a bit of a sucker for blue phones. I don't mind the design, but I've got to say, I've seen so many phones that have this kind of reflective blue thing going on over the past couple of years. So it might have been nice to see a few different variants here in Australia. There may be other models available overseas, and if you know about those, tell me about them in the comments below. Let's get on to power, because this is one of the big selling points of this particular phone. Now, for a lot of mid-range phones right now, you'll typically see a Qualcomm Snapdragon 600 or 700 series processor, typically more the 700s, but it depends on the make and model. And that's not what Realme's done for this phone. Instead, it's rocking a Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 Plus processor, and that's basically the processor brain of late 2019 flagship phones. Indeed, there are flagship phones that you can buy right now in the $1,500 to $2,000 basket that have this exact same processor in them. The model that Realme has sent me is the effective flagship. It's got 12 gig of RAM and 256 gig of onboard storage. There's a slightly cheaper model, which will actually be the more mass market model here in Australia, in fact, which has only 8 gig of RAM and 128 gig of storage. The big catch there, though, is that it's sealed storage. There's no micro SD card slot. Again, that would have been nice to see, but I'll take it for getting the power of that 855 Plus. And in using this phone, because I've tested quite a few flagships, and this year's phones tend to have the 865 rather than 855, and while the 865 is that bit more powerful, the practical reality is we really haven't hit a whole lot of apps. There's not been a lot developed that absolutely must have that level of power. And it's a really important and powerful consideration. Just like those budget phones generally have enough everyday power, having a phone with last year's flagship processor is not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, the obvious thing that you do miss out on with this phone is there's no 5G on board. And look, again, would have been nice, but at this price point, it also would have been the cheapest 5G phone you can buy in Australia right now, and not by a small margin either. So it's understandable. But look, this thing runs anything that I've thrown at it perfectly fine. No particular problems. It's good with games. It's good with editing software. It's fine for browsing and multi-tab on all those, and social media and all those usual things that you might do with a phone. Plenty fast enough. The other side of its performance story is, of course, the software. Now, this is an Android 10 device, but it's running Realme's Real UI. Now, Realme, when they launched in Australia, were offering up Oppo's ColorOS, because, they're all part of the same hardware family, and Realme UI is sort of a bit of a reskin of that. There's definitely bits of ColorOS floating around in there in terms of the way it tends to treat things. I'll say this, I'm not a huge fan of it. I generally, personally, prefer a much cleaner Android experience that you get with phones from, say, HMD Global, for example, but it's fine, it gets the job done. And of course, this is Android. You can skin it however you like. You can run whichever apps you like. I should make note of the fact that the inbuilt apps do ask for a lot of slightly odd permissions, which I'm not super comfortable with, but again, it's Android. You don't have to use them. You can run whatever you like. Really, no complaints. This is pretty much the fastest and best mid-range phone in terms of processing power you can get right now. But that's not where the X3 Super Zoom story ends, because, of course, there's also the camera. I mean, you wouldn't call a phone Super Zoom if it didn't have some kind of zooming capability. So with that big camera bump on the back, what do you actually get? Well, you get a primary 64 megapixel sensor, and we've seen quite a few of those in phones of late, along with an 8 megapixel 5-time optical periscope lens, an 8 megapixel wide lens, and a 2 megapixel macro lens. So this is a mid-range phone with an actual quad lens array. It's not quad lens in that you get 3 plus some kind of focusing lens. There are 4 addressable lenses here, which is quite nice and quite flexible. Now, the primary sensor shoots at a fairly good level. I'm only going to say fairly good here because this thing does start to push up in a capability sense towards what you can see out of those $2,000 flagships. It's not quite on their level. The low light performance is not quite up there with the very best we've seen out of the likes of Apple or Huawei or Samsung. It's still very good. It's going to meet most people's needs without a problem. And of course, the star of the show here is that periscope lens. This is the cheapest phone you can get a periscope lens in that I'm aware of, at least certainly in the Australian market. And look, up to its native 5x optical, not a problem. Shoots really, really nicely. You can see some sample shots I've taken here, and you can zoom in 5x, no problem, because of course that's its optical length. It does a 10x hybrid zoom, where it pixel bends that 64 meg sensor to give it a bit of a boost, and that's fine too. Now, if you push it further, this thing can go up to 60 times zoom, but like every other ridiculously long zoom lens on a mobile phone this year, the shots you get are just absolute garbage. I mean, if you want to really peer into your neighbour's backyard, well, the police should probably come around and have a talk to you about that kind of activity. You can, but you're not going to get anything in terms of a usable photo when you do so. So look, up to 10 times, maybe 15, 20 if you're on a tripod, you can get some reasonable sort of shots. Anything further than that, and it's a toy to show people, but it's not actually a usable, functional thing. What I really like about this camera though is the fact that you get those quad lenses, which gives you just lots of flexibility, lots of choices. And yeah, there are some compromises. The macro lens is only 2 megapixels, so you're not going to get great shots out of that, but they're workable. And look, I've seen far worse in a lot of mid-range phones this year and last year. There's a lot of power in play here, and of course, having that Snapdragon behind it doesn't hurt when it comes to doing its own post-processing. It's got a degree of AI built in as well. Around the front, you do lose a bit of screen space to those dual cameras, but it means that this is one of the first cameras, basically since what, the Pixel 3, I guess, that's got both standard selfies and ultra-wide selfies. And sure, right now in 2020, we might not be getting around in groups and doing too many ultra-wide selfies, but obviously, if you want to get more of the backdrop in your own selfie or in your family shots, it's a nice little feature to have. I can certainly live with a hole punch that big, but then I'm maybe not as fussy about hole punches as some people. So on battery power, Realme's gone sort of moderate, 4200 milliamp battery, sealed. That's par for the course for a lot of phones. It's not the biggest that you'll see. It's certainly not small though. Battery life is fair. I've certainly been able to run it flat in a day if I'm using it really, really heavily, because that Snapdragon 855 Plus uses a lot of power if it's going to do a lot of things. But you can get into a second day without too many troubles. I've certainly seen flagships that do a little bit better than this. In the mid-range, there are some phones that will outpace this, but they're nowhere near as powerful. I think it's a fair trade-off. Now, what you don't get with this phone is any kind of wireless charging. Again, mid-range space, that's pretty much to be expected. It does do very fast charging. Realme calls it dash charging. It's undoubtedly a variant of Oppo's own VOOC charging, and you can boost up the battery very, very quickly, very nicely, as long as you've got that supplied charger. Otherwise, any other USB-C charger will do. It'll just charge a bit more slowly. So who is this phone good for? Well, look, if you want a bit more power than you get out of those budget phones, including several of the budget Realme models you can buy right now, then this is a really, really good buy. There are a few challenges. The screen is LCD rather than AMOLED. There's no wireless charging. The battery life could perhaps be a little bit better. But overall, this is an incredibly pleasing device for the money. It's not just a good mid-range device, it's a really good challenger device for that contention that you have to spend over $1,000 to get a really compelling, fun phone to use. I really didn't expect for a mid-range phone to excite me this much in 2020, but this is actually one of the best phones I've tested this year, without a doubt. So who shouldn't buy it? Well, the flip side of that, of course, is you've got to like Real UI, and yeah, I'm not a big fan myself. There are some compromises around it, and obviously if you do want really strong photographic muscle, then you're going to need to spend a little bit more. There's no water resistance as well. I forgot to mention that earlier, but you really don't want to dunk this thing in water. I had it rained on in one instance. Sorry about that, Realme. I got your phone slightly wet, but hey, it survived it, so maybe that was a fair test. But there's a few features that you don't get, and obviously there is room for improvement. What's really exciting about this, of course, is that if Realme can do this at this price, then others can as well. And that means we could be about to see an explosion of really excellent mid-range phones. But until we do, this is a highly recommended device. So that's my take on the Realme X3 Super Zoom. What do you think? Are you keen on a quad lens camera? You like colorless style? Or is there another phone that would capture your attention more? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.